Well, hello friends. We're back at SeniorFlix once more with our friend Eric Tappenden from Chapel Ridge Funeral Home. At our last segment, Eric talked about the prearranging of funerals and who does it and why they do it, how much it costs and where the money goes and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to continue our conversation this morning, Eric. It was good to hear you telling us that prearranging and the safety, the money's all looked after. So let's suppose somebody wants to prearrange. What do they have to do? How do they start that process? Do they go to the yellow pages, which we don't have anymore, or do they just call you or call any funeral home saying, I want to prearrange? What's the process?
So every funeral home in Ontario does prearranging. Some of them embrace it more than others. Some of them are, no, we don't want the hassle of having to do all that with the money and spend the time with people ahead of time. At Chapel Ridge, we really embrace prearrangement as an important thing for families because it helps them to not be burdened with all the logistics at the time of the funeral, and it saves them money. What happens, though, is you phone the funeral home and you talk to one of the funeral directors. We have 3 people who specifically only do prearrangement. They're trained funeral directors, but they only do prearrangement. And you sit down with them, and you can do it at the funeral home if you're comfortable going there, or you can have them to your home, or you can meet them at Tim Hortons, a neutral ground. You know, wherever you're comfortable, you can talk about it. Most of the time, when I meet with people, I meet with them more than once. And the first thing we would do is outline the process for them, and then we'd talk about all their options and the costs. And I usually say to people, don't sign anything today. Like, you don't want to be talked into something that you don't want or don't need. And very often it's important that you go away and talk to your spouse or talk to your adult children, talk to your family, get a consensus around, you know, in the Tappenden family or the Baker family, what's a good funeral? What is that? And so if you go away with the information, you can sleep on it, as long as you don't sleep on it too long, and then come back to a second appointment. And there's really 3 things that we would do when we prearrange. The first one is we collect all of the information from the person that we would need at the time of death in order to register the death, get the burial permit, or get the cremation certificate. So collect all of the what we call vital statistics information. And we collect all that and document it, put it in the file. The second thing then is to talk about what kind of a funeral do you want? And so we would go through all of the options and choices and costs, and then we would end up from that documenting in a prepaid funeral contract. And it has to be itemized in accordance with provincial law, so it's very clear what it is you're entitled to. You know, you don't just say package C or something like that. You itemize literally everything, and that's then signed off by the person, by the funeral director. And then the third thing is, if you want to pay for it ahead of time, how do you want to do that? And we go through all of the choices about paying all at once, paying it over 1 year with no additional cost, or paying it over longer periods of time. There's a premium for that, obviously, but you are insured against premature death if you do that. And there's no right or wrong way to do that. Everybody's different, everybody's budget is different, everybody's outlook on how they want to pay for it is different. So we don't have any preference. It's whatever suits the family, and you can do it with pre-authorized checking or on your Visa card if you want to get the points. And yeah, we just try to make it as easy as possible for people.
You say you give them choices. Now,
Yeah.
the choices, I suppose there are 2 main choices, is a burial or a cremation.
Yep.
Now, if it's going to be a burial, do you then say, well, here's some caskets you can pick from?
Yep.
And do they pick a certain casket at a certain price? And that's what they're going to have, a nice oak casket or a white one?
Yep.
I assume that's what you offer them?
Absolutely. So there are really 3 chunks of the cost of a funeral. One of them is the funeral home service charge, and that would include the staffing, the vehicles, the facilities, the embalming or preparation of the body, the transfer of the body, all of the stuff that we do and all of the pieces of that. The second thing then is the casket and any other funeral merchandise, a burial vault or an urn. And the third category would be the disbursements. So things like the cremation fee or the clergy honorarium, the Toronto Star notice, or any of the things, government fees and taxes. And so those three things are added up. And yeah, people choose a casket. Sometimes people like to come to the funeral home so they can go into the casket room and look and feel and touch, because sometimes choosing from a picture doesn't, it's not exactly what you want. I always say to people when you come to the funeral home, let's go into the casket room and have a look. And just to make them comfortable, I always say, don't worry, we won't make you try it on. You can, you can just go and feel and touch.
So you don't have a fitting room?
We don't have a fitting room, no. And the other thing that's maybe a little different about our funeral home is we work hard not to upsell people. I think people have had experiences in some cases where they feel like there's been pressure to buy something more expensive than they want. And, caskets are all expensive because they're made out of hardwood usually, and there's about the same amount of timber in a casket as there is in a dining room table and chairs, and usually the craftsmanship is just as good as furniture. So they're all expensive, but you don't have to measure how much you love somebody by how much you spend on their casket. You don't.
I like that.
And we tell people that.
That's good.
And so as long as it looks reasonable, traditional, if that's what you want, something traditional. I always remember one of the popes who died, and I forget which one, but made a statement by having a plain pine box. And his statement, without saying it, was, I don't want this to be elaborate. There's no reason for that. And so we really work hard to say to people, there's lots of choices which aren't expensive that can still look tasteful and reasonable, dignified.
Good.
Yeah, without being expensive.
So burial and a casket is one thing. Cremation, you said in our earlier interview that cremations have increased to now where 80% of all funerals are cremations.
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of traditional Christians that think that cremation is perhaps not what we should be doing with our bodies because they think of the resurrection and all that kind of thing.
Yes.
Why should a Christian consider cremation then?
Well, I never, ever want to talk anyone into choosing either burial or cremation. I always say to people, you should do what your family is comfortable with. You don't want people waking up in the middle of the night having nightmares about, gee, we never should have done that to my dad. We never should have buried them because they didn't like to think about worms, or we should never have cremated them because I can't, the fire. So you need to do what your family's comfortable with. But, from a Christian perspective, historically, the church was not supportive of cremation. And there was two reasons for that. Really, when I say the church, it was primarily historically the Catholic Church that was against cremation. And in fact, cremation was only officially allowed by the Catholic Church in 1963 with the Vatican II changes, the liberalization of some of their doctrines. And the reasons they were against cremation, there was two main reasons. Number one, as the Catholic Church went around the world evangelizing, they came across cultures that they considered at the time pagan. So places like India and China where people were Hindu or Buddhist, and they practiced cremation. So they thought, well, if these people are pagan and they cremate, then cremation must be pagan. So we don't want to do that. Secondly, there's the issue of, the bodily resurrection when Christ comes again. And so if the body's going to be resurrected, then we don't want to destroy it any more than it already is. When a body's been in the ground for 50 years, there's not a whole lot of it left. And so if Jesus can put together again the remains of a fully articulated skeletal body he can put together cremated remains. And so I think, the Catholic Church at the time realized this and thought, okay, well, if you're cremated, it's going to be miraculous, a new spiritual body we're going to get anyway, according to the book of Corinthians. So we don't need to be hardline about that. Now, the Catholic Church still has restrictions that if you want to be cremated, you have to, A, bury the cremated remains in sacred ground, I guess, so Jesus knows where to find them. And secondly, to keep them all together. You can't split them up and scatter them and divide them up among family members to take away. I think among evangelical Christians, there's just been a resistance to change, and I think that most of the pastors that I have heard preach on this subject, is it okay for Christians to cremate? Most of them would say that in Scripture, it's an area of liberty, that Scripture doesn't say thou shalt bury or thou shalt not cremate, that it's an area of liberty. And so I say to people, do what your family's comfortable with.
I would offer a personal note on that. My father was in the military in the Second World War, and he was in the Navy. Just after I was born, he went back to sea, and his ship was torpedoed off the coast of Newfoundland. And his body was plunged to the ocean depths, where I'm sure whatever remains there were eaten by fish or sharks. And the bones were I don't know what happens to bones when they're in the bottom of the ocean, but I see there's no difference to cremation in that, because his body is totally unrecoverable. And I am assured if he was a follower of Jesus Christ, that he would be safe anyway. So I can see the aspect of some people wondering, well, if we're getting rid of a body, but as a pastor, I would also say it is a very liberal thing. It's something we have a choice.
Yeah.
God has, we have a right to, we have a duty to take care of the remains of our loved ones.
Yep.
And how we take care of those remains, as long as it's done in a dignified manner.
Dignity and respect.
Yes.
Those are the two qualifiers, right?
And I think, from what I've seen of Chapel Ridge, and I've worked a lot with Chapel Ridge, I've done several funerals with Chapel Ridge of your funeral directors, and always a dignified approach. So it's so wonderful to see that. Well, we're going to close this segment, and we're going to come back in a later one just to go over a couple more questions I have for you regarding. So thanks for watching again, and we'll be back with Eric in a little while. Thank you.